Yeah, thanks, Alex. G'day, everyone. Welcome. A very warm welcome from everyone on this hall for what promises to be a really engaging and interesting forum. I'm not going to dilly-dally, and so I'll introduce to you our first speaker, Professor Amin Saikal. Professor Saikal is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Islamic Studies at the ADFA. He is a specialist in the politics, history, political economy, and international relations of Middle East and Central Asia. He's been a visiting fellow at Princeton, Cambridge, and Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, as well as the Rockefeller Foundation Fellow of International Relations. In April 2006, he was also appointed a member of the Order of Australia. So, with no further ado, I'll hand over the microphone to Professor Saikal.
Well, thank you very much. I didn't know that I was going to be the first speaker, and it's a very pleasure to be back in this hall because I lived here for a few years and I had this of my undergraduate years to study in this hall. I know excellent training. I don't know much about it. That's something that I will leave for my colleagues, but they do know something about the Middle East. Let me put the current popular uprisings in the Arab world and a bit of historical perspective. These uprisings, from my perspective, mark the third Arab awakening in the last 14th century. The first awakening came with the advent of Islam early in the 7th century, which resulted in a large Islamization of Arab culture and societies. It united the social divide and viewing Arabs as one people on the world stage, and this was instrumental in enabling the Arabs to spearhead the building of a multicultural, multi-ethnic empire of faith, and indeed a majestic civilization. However, the Arabs faced significant challenges from the Crusaders and the Mongolians that resulted in the sacking of Baghdad in 1958, and Baghdad then was the glorious capital of the Arab Islamic Empire of the Abbasids. From then on, the Arabs lost control over their destiny. Their destiny was to be decided for them largely at first by the Ottomans and subsequently by European colonial powers, France and Britain in particular, culminating in the United States' geopolitical dominance in the Middle East after World War II. The second Arab awakening came with anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, and anti-Zionist Arab struggle, which under Jamal Abdel Nasser resulted in consolidation of radical Arab nationalism. But the result was mixed. That partly helped the Arabs to recover from their past humiliation and restore their dignity. But in the meantime, it divided the Arab world and plunged it into a cold war of their own, and it failed to enable the Arab peoples to free themselves from the tradition of political authoritarianism and in favor of political pluralism and democratic participation in charting their destiny. They were failed by the leaderships and the major powers, most importantly the United States, that backed most of the regimes in the region. Ruled by corruption, secret police, patronage, and inequitable socio-economic development became the order of the day, playing a critical role in generating a widening gulf between the rulers and the ruled. The third awakening of the Arabs has come with the current popular uprisings, which have already resulted in the overthrow of the dictatorial rule of Ben Ali in Tunisia and Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, and a bloody struggle in Bahrain, Libya, Yemen, and Syria, and threatening many more authoritarian regimes across the Arab world. This time, the Arab people's struggle is for genuine self-determination in 800 years since 1248. Of course, this is not to claim that they will certainly succeed. Revolutions have failed, betrayed, and devoured its leaders and children in the past. The Iran Revolution of 1978-79 is before us in this respect. It's important to be reminded that the situation in the countries where the revolutions have succeeded and the fall of the dictatorial regime, that is Tunisia and Egypt, remain very good. In the case of Egypt, what has taken place is essentially a military coup d'etat, this time driven not by the military but by the people. As we know, the military has rarely proved to be an agent of democratic change. You can expect the Egyptian military to seek to manage the transitions in ways which would not seriously disadvantage itself and some other forces closely associated with the Mubarak regime. The Arab people have nonetheless made a pro-democracy start, but this is the beginning of a long, arduous, and painful journey. None of the Arab countries currently have the necessary institutional and traditional foundations ranging from separation of powers, rule of law, and independent judiciary, and vibrant civil society. The success of the Arab people's awakening will depend on how the transition is managed and how the outside powers, especially the United States, will balance their geopolitical interests with the Arab people's democratic aspirations. The United States does not have a history that can give us much confidence in this respect. The Obama administration's recent veto of a United Nations Security Council resolution condemning Israeli settlement activities in the Palestinian occupied territories underline this point. Also, can the U.S. reconcile its support of the right of the Arab people to freedom and reform with the need to do the same in relation to the Palestinian people under Israeli occupation? I would like to end this talk, as I have been instructed to speak only for about 10 minutes, with 3 points. The first is that there has been a more distant view since the Iran Revolution over 30 years ago that the Shia Muslims are more rebellious and that the Sunni Muslims have been more accommodating towards public authorities. Well, the Egyptian and Tunisian revolution have debunked this myth. The second is that the role of social media should not be exaggerated. The Polish Revolution, the Filipino Revolution, and the Iranian Revolution predated the social media. It is ultimately the people's power. Noam Chomsky once said, in the wake of the breakup of the Soviet Union and the emergence of the United States as the sole superpower in the world, that actually there are 2 superpowers. One is the United States and the other is the people of the world. The third point is that, and that brings me to my colleagues who are going to speak often, that the conditions in China are very different from those of the Arab world. The blend of party, military security, and administrative apparatus is formally structured and entrenched in China in the case with the Arab world. This together with China's massive rate of economic growth, military powers, and expanding domestic market will cushion against an impact from the Arab appliances for a time being. That's not to say that China is immune from a popular revolt, given all its internal contradictions. What it does suggest is that if it occurs, it will emanate from within China. There is unlikely to be a movement from Tahrir Square to the Tiananmen Square. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Professor Saikal, for that excellent talk. Now, we'll take a short stroll down the Silk Road to China, and I'll introduce you our next speaker, Dr. Anthony Burke. Anthony Burke is an associate professor of politics and international relations at UNSW at ADFA. He was awarded his PhD in political science at ADFA in 1999, after which he has taught at the University of Adelaide and Queensland. He's also a co-editor with Richard and Jim George of Intro to ACYA, a book that we did here at Melbourne Church. He's published in many different areas, including security studies, international ethics, war and peace, Australian culture and foreign policy, Southeast Asian security, Middle East conflict, terrorism, and political and international relations theory. His current interests include war and peace, new security agendas and conflicts, human security, cosmopolitanism, and climate change. So, I feel very good. I welcome to Dr. Anthony Burke.
Thank you, Edward. Thanks for this invitation. It's a very interesting kind of attempt to bring a couple of very important regions together. And as a political scientist, one of the first things I think about as I look at what's happening in the Middle East is that one of the most powerful ideas in politics is this idea of popular sovereignty. The idea that people should be able to govern themselves through representatives who are accountable, capable, responsive, and whose government generates a range of social goods and provides security to their people. I would also think that the authoritarian idea that the people can't be trusted to govern themselves and that a small area must do so protected from popular sentiment is also a very powerful idea. However, I think the story of the 20th century, let alone the last few months, is one in which the idea of popular sovereignty has become more and more powerful. And I think we're seeing that now throughout the Middle East and North Africa. So, without endorsing Francis Fukuyama's thesis about human history, which I think had many dangerous features, I think we can predict that within a few decades, the world will be solely made up of constitutional democracies of various kinds. The question then for international relations and people working in that area is how this happens. How do authoritarian regimes form? And what is the fallout from that process? What comes after it? What kind of damage is done during the process? Is there prolonged violence or instability, economic crisis, insurgency, genocide or civil war? Or is there peace? Is the government that follows a legitimate and decent one? Are enduring and legitimate structures put in place? Change, when it comes, often comes quickly, and it brings unpredictable results. But And I think those kind of questions resonated through a whole series of changes and crises since the 1980s. From Afghanistan in the 1990s, after the Soviet withdrawal, everything descended into a civil war, to post-apartheid Indonesia and Timor, the Balkans, post-Soviet Russia and Canadian republics, Iran, Iraq, and a happier example, Taiwan. These questions, I think, also loom in relation to North Korea and Burma, and over the longer term in the People's Republic of China. And obviously these questions are really live ones. These questions are really live ones in relation to Egypt, Libya, which I'll turn to, and who knows, Syria, where some pretty disturbing news has been coming out over the last few days. There are obviously really significant questions about human rights, international security, and international order at stake in how these, decay of authoritarian regimes takes place, how it plays out. And I think there's a fundamental question. What is the responsibility of the international community in the face of these kind of uncertainties? Now, I want to talk in particular about one aspect of that, which is the responsibility to protect. But I think the question is a much broader one, about how new orders are put in place and how you can responsibly play a role. So I have been interested in the way China has reacted to these unfolding events in the Middle East. As an authoritarian state presiding over a rapidly growing and globally crucial economy, China has strong interests in seeking to restrict the human rights and pro-democracy agenda and to restrict interventions. It's also got significant strategic interests, especially in regard to energy security and the supply of raw materials in Africa and the Gulf, and a growing level of foreign investment in numerous regional countries, including countries like Sudan, Kenya, and Zimbabwe. I think these kind of interests have probably shaped its very muted response to the fall of the Burke's regime in Egypt, and have called for stability and said that outside power should stay out. At the same time as it's got these strategic interests, China is a growing world power, and it's a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And as such, it has responsibility for global security order, what the UN has called collective security. And it has this kind of responsibility at a time of rapid evolution, of broadening the global security agenda and international norms. And when I think about the Sudan and Libya, there are two permanent developments there. The establishment of the International Criminal Court and the adoption of this new principle of humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect. And most of you will know that this R2P principle was developed in 2004 after a request from the UN Secretary General, Kofi Annan, for a panel of states, people and experts for the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. The panel argued that national sovereignty also brought with it a responsibility to protect the population from crimes against humanity and other gross violations of human rights and mass suffering. And if the responsible state failed to do that, it became the responsibility of the global community through the UN to provide that protection, either by preventing or if things have gone too far by reacting and rebuilding. These are the three parts of the responsibility to protect. They have very restrictive threshold criteria for military intervention in particular. This is restricted to large-scale loss of life or ethnic cleansing. and there are a range of precautionary principles applied to any planned military action. I think in the back of their minds were a number of failed interventions in the past and the still legitimate 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now, China has endorsed these two principles of this doctrine. At the UN World Summit, it signed itself up to the final declaration that affirmed the responsibility to protect. But I think it's been slow to align foreign policy either with the preventive recommendations of that doctrine or the implications of the responsibility to react. The core issue here is that effective reaction in such cases often goes beyond Chapter 7, Chapter 6, peacekeeping, the traditional approach which comes as an invitation of the state, and where intervening force remains neutral and only uses force to protect its own troops. Yet as the international community found in Bosnia and East Timor, this approach can fail to prevent crimes against humanity. And it was a problem that was the major focus of the 2000 UN report on peacekeeping, chaired by Amin. So effective intervention is more often carried out under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and Security Council resolutions often have this language about enabling force to use all necessary means to protect civilians under the Chapter 7. What that means is often direct military engagement forces who threaten or attack civilians. And that in turn raises all kinds of tactical and strategic and diplomatic complexities. China's pattern of voting in the Security Council in such situations has been consistently to support the Chapter 6 approach to peacekeeping. Sometimes with contributions of its own forces, and seeking to block or refuse to endorse Chapter 7 interventions. For example, in relation to Darfur, in 2004, China tried to kick off the agenda. Later proposed plans to impose an arms embargo, not incidentally because it was a major supplier of light weapons to Sudan. It imposed sanctions on the petroleum industry. China did support resolutions introducing peacekeepers into Darfur, promoting conflict resolution efforts, and it abstained on those imposing sanctions. It also abstained on the historic resolution in March 2005 that referred a number of Sudanese leaders to the International Criminal Court and eventually indicted Sudan's president. Interestingly, by 2006, it had started to put pressure on Sudan to welcome UN peacekeepers and voted to support resolutions, particularly in 2007, that authorised a hybrid African Union UN force in the Sudan, in Darfur, under Chapter 7 mandate. However, that's probably going to be the exception. I think China's discomfort with Chapter 7 interventions, even if they are consistent with R2P principles, is evident in its vote a couple of weeks ago to abstain from Resolution 1973 of the Security Council authorising this notified under Libya. We also know that people Stanley also expressed opposition to military action, likening it to the invasion of Iraq. And inside the Sixth Edition warned that the attacks could open Pandora's box and chaos. The Foreign Ministry has also expressed serious reservations about military action. However, I think just as significant as these, in many ways, reasonable concerns is the fact that China did not use its veto to block the resolution, and nor did Russia. They and other three countries that didn't want to support the intervention, Germany, India and Brazil, did not vote no. They abstained. And China stated at the time that it was a wish to the African Union and the Arab League that would have factored in its decision to abstain and not to vote against it. Interestingly, one of the appeals of the authors of the original responsibility to protect reform was that if a permanent member is not happy with an intervention, that they very least should not use their veto. So China has been consistent with that appeal. So to conclude with a couple of brief points. I personally believe that the responsibility to protect is a major step forward for international society, particularly in implementing its obligations under the Genocide Convention to prevent genocide. But it is the responsibility of states who want to invoke the doctrine like France has in its case to ensure that these missions are successful, consistent with the doctrine, and answer experience for other strategic interests or more expansive regime change interventions. So I think against that background, China can use its ambivalence about the intervention constructively by remaining diplomatically engaged, by using its influence to the extent it has some, to help ensure that the next phases of this intervention in Libya do not turn into the disasters that they may fear. Thanks.
The reading of China is certainly very interesting and for some troubling issue in our society today. I just remind everyone as we head towards question time whether to keep taking notes or making bookmarks in your own head about particular points, areas, or issues that you would like to raise about happening after this final speaker. But our final speaker is Emeritus Professor Peter Drysdale. Professor Peter Drysdale is Emeritus Professor of Economics and the head of the East Asian Bureau of Economic Research and the East Asia Forum at AMU's Corporate School of Economics and Government. Professor Drysdale has many areas of interest, although there are many include international trade and economic policy, diplomacy, the East Asian economy, Australia's economic relations with Asia and Pacific, and more recently, foreign direct investment. His expertise encompasses work on the Japanese economy, as well as the Chinese economy, its trade relations and transformation. His academic focus includes developments in the Asia-Pacific economic integration and relations between East Asia, Europe, India, ADFA. In the standards for the ADFA tenure at the AMU, he has supervised over 40 students, so he's a wonderful mentor, and his services to the University of Community were awarded just last year when he was conferred an honorary doctorate of letters by the Australian National University. So please join me in welcoming Professor Drysdale.
Thank you very much for the warm and extensive introduction. When you said I'd recently turned to work on foreign direct investment, I got a bit of a shock because it said something about my age. I wrote my first book on foreign direct investment in 1970, and I suppose in some measure that's more recent than other things I've done. What I'm talking about tonight is to spin off this discussion that we've been having about the Middle East and its with China. And I've got not much to add to what Amin and Tony said, but maybe I can sort of give a bit of the way in some respects by looking at this thing in the context of international political development. I think the first thing to say is that what's going on in the Middle East is obviously important to everyone. It's important to us, to the Western world, because of the importance of the Middle East as a crucible of energy security to industrial economies. And you wouldn't have said the same thing about China a little more than 2 decades ago, but you have to say it now. Over 3/4 of China's carbon and energy supplies are drawn across the Indian Ocean from Africa and the Middle East. So it too, like the rest of the industrial world, has become heavily dependent upon the strategic supply of energy out of the Middle East. So it has that importance, and Amin was paying due attention to that. It sets the interaction between China and the Middle East around the core interests of China's strategic supplies of energy out of the Middle East. As Amin observed, what's gone on in the Middle East, at least through some prisons, over the last, remarkably, over the last year or so, also potentially plays into political developments in other parts of the world, including China. And if you characterise China as an authoritarian political system, I think Tony made a distinction between authoritarian political systems and pluralist political systems. By many measures, you characterise the Chinese system as an authoritarian political system, challenged by whatever transformations are taking place in the Middle East towards more pluralistic political systems. Although, I always say to myself, as soon as I say something like this, we haven't seen the end of what's going on in the Middle East, and we don't know quite where the end will be, so we should be very cautious about defining the end point of what's going on in the Middle East. I think we talk about that separately. But again, this is like defining authoritarianism compared with what? When my wife buys a new dress, she always tells me it's a cheap dress. But as an economist, I always have in the back of my mind, yes, they're cheap compared with what? Because that's the relevant question. It might be cheap compared with something you buy on the Champs-Élysées, but not cheap compared with what's got to fit in my budget. And the same thing goes in respect to the analysis of political systems and their significance in international behaviour. Because if you define the Chinese state as an authoritarian political system, you also have to go on and say, well, compared with the Chinese system 10, 15, 20, certainly 30 years ago, it's a less authoritarian political system than it was, which has to do with what I want to say about how political developments in the Middle East do or do not, as Amin rightly said, play into the political developments in China. Outside China and some inside China, as it's turned out, a relatively small number inside China, saw perhaps the makings of a Jasmine revolution in China around developments in the Middle East. That turned out to be a real visit, although some people probably wish it wasn't, for good and other reasons. It was a real visit for 3 or 4 reasons, some of which Amin touched upon. Important was a real visit because China has delivered to its people, the Communist Party, the authoritarian government in China has delivered to its people over the last 30 or 40 years. Significant change in human welfare around all the problems that have been in Chinese economic development. There's been a huge elevation in economic and material welfare in China and therefore economic security in China, and that underpins the legitimacy of the Chinese government, the Communist Party, and the way in which it currently rules China. And that's the underlying reason why there's not much willingness to go out on the streets as people did in Egypt and stand for any new system. Post-Amin, of course, the language of political change turned very much from the language of revolution to the language of reform, and that's still the language that dominates political discourse in China. It's the second important reason why Middle Eastern politics don't translate readily into Chinese politics. The state is pervasive and effective in repressing political activity, but I don't think that's by far and away the most important reason why it was unexciting to the Chinese people as a whole to emulate what was going on in Egypt and what's going on elsewhere in the Middle East. I think the most important reason is that China was delivered, the Chinese government was delivered in a significant way to the Chinese people. That doesn't mean there aren't a lot of problems. 100,000 incidents a year of protest and disputation. But the Chinese government, because it's become a less authoritarian system over the years, but it's still an authoritarian system, has become much more responsive to the disaffection of people in the course of social change and economic change and so on in China, and manage that process, however, inexpertly from time to time and physically from time to time, continues to manage that process very well. So there are four good reasons really why the Middle East doesn't play with China. But I think what's interesting about the Middle East and China, China's strategic position in the Middle East, and a growing strategic position almost everywhere in the world. If you look at all our neighbours in Asia, including Australia, of course, China is, for more than half of them, their largest economic partner, as it is for us. In Brazil, China is the largest economic partner, not the United States and so on. So China has a big presence. That brings with it, of course, a Chinese presence in many parts of the world, including in the Middle East and Africa. And it leads to a Chinese interest in these affairs. It extends beyond the mere business of drawing oil from the wells of the Middle East and transshipping them to tankers across the Indian Ocean, in the process having American fleet protection for the security of that trade, and tentatively moving up with some greater naval presence to establish more security surrounding that trade. In all sorts of ways, it means that China has feet on the ground in many parts of the world, and prominently because of that energy strategic interest in the Middle East and in Africa. So, sort of trying to bring all this together in some way, it raises to me a pretty important question about this moment, not only in Middle Eastern history, but this moment in Chinese history. Because I think, 20, 30 years down the track, you as all mature people contemplating this in retrospect, will look upon this as some rather critical turning point. I call it China's great power moment, perhaps, where the first time China has to think of itself as principles, the thing that guides it in its approach to international affairs, and Tony mentioned a number of those, in a different way. You can't, when you become a power of the reach that China has now, almost by self-accident, you can't behave in the same way as you might have when you were beginning that process 30 years ago. Essentially, it's a little country, a small country, even though it's geographically big in size, it's a small country in terms of economic and political power. You have to protect your citizens if they're starting living in the middle of a conflagration, and take that responsibility seriously. And you have to think about circumstances in which you could afford to say non-intervention is the principle whereby the order all international behaviour relatively easy because you weren't much involved in it anyway. You have to think about that in a totally different way. And so China abstained in UN resolutions 1973. But China also intervened to rescue 32,000 citizens out of the Libyan crisis. China has taken actions which are very different from the actions you would have expected China to have taken, for example, in the 1980s, even in the 1970s. And this means that China's conception of itself, not only in its international behaviour, is bound to change around these international involvements in which it has to be engaged in a different way, but also others' conception of China will have to change and begin to change. Now, I conclude by saying that there's no one moment that defines these turning points in human history. When power shifts in status in this way, it seems to take quite a long time for it to happen. It will take quite a long time for this to happen in respect of China. But there seem to be, in retrospect, as I said, some particular points that are particularly important in that transformation. And I will say, perhaps, at this time, my guess is, and I'll be dead, so you can judge it long after I'm dead, whether this is proven true or false, that this is one such turning point for China. It's China's great power moment where it has to define its behaviour in the international community in a different way from what it's defined in the past, and that will have a profound effect, ultimately much more profound indirect effect on political behaviour and political organisation and political structure in China than any direct transmission of the influence of the revolution that's taken place in the Middle East and might have had on political developments in China currently. There are a few thoughts that stem from Amin's remarks and Tony's remarks and add the perspective of a sort of political comments to the discussion. Thank you very much.
One of the caterers has just said that one of his cars has been parked in by a little white car, so
and thanks to that final presentation of the night, we've reached a turning point in world politics, and we've reached a turning point in our forum tonight. So it's now question time. Alex, our coordinator of the Middle East Learning Community, has one broken mic to hear around. So if anyone has a question would like to raise their hands, Alex will come and move the microphone.
This one will probably be directed more at Dr. Burke. You said during the session, apologies if I incorrectly paraphrase, that France has taken upon themselves and listed others in the responsibility to protect, and thus they are obliged to see a certain level of success in their environmental potential in the enforcement of their fighting in Libya. What would qualify as a success in this situation? I mean, from just the way I see it, there's 4 outcomes, that I just put at the top of my head, and 3 involve the Gaddafi, but one also probably involves Gaddafi winning if they don't do enough.
Okay, we've got it. Right. Okay, great. I shall relax as I do this still going. Any other questions? It's a very good question. The success is, if you read the ADFA doctrine, it's about preventing the atrocities as early as possible and as well as possible. The mission maintained broad international legitimacy, and then producing peace afterwards, the responsibility to rebuild. And as we know, a lot of these interventions are somewhat ad hoc. They happen fast, no one's planned for them, they happen coordinated. And in that way, I think Russia's insistence on excluding ground forces from the resolution may well have done everyone a favour. Although we now have talk from France about arming the rebels, and if you read the New York Times overnight, a raging debate in Washington about it, which includes comments from leaders in the US intelligence community that we don't know much about these rebels. We don't know who they are, what they stand for, what their plans are. So there's no idea of an end game, although there is a very highly developed international diplomatic intervention, humanitarian machinery that could come in after to assist the Libyans to rebuild. Now, immediately I think they don't have a way of stopping the civil war militarily. All they can do is kind of degrade Libyan forces if they're not in populated, Libyan government forces if they're not in populated areas. But they have no way of actually stopping and ending the civil war. And then the question is, what if Gaddafi remains in power? So I think there are these, some very, very loose ends here. And I think there are some strategic interests hiding in the background too. The fact that Gaddafi has no friends. This matters. Some of these interventions are somewhat selective. It's made him much more vulnerable than some other leaders in that situation. And yeah, just finish this up. What I would say is that humanitarian intervention sounds nice in principle, but actually intervening in this kind of conflicts to protect civilians and then to end them is complicated and difficult. And I do not believe that militaries and foreign ministries around the world have yet either hit upon or really worked hard at trying to develop a formula for it. And I think we'll see that play out. Let's hope it doesn't play out too badly.
Further questions? Just following on from that, what do you think happens in a situation where we get another one or two or three of these countries requesting intervention? What's the response? In the immediate future?
What happens if you have three more countries needing or requesting this kind of intervention?
Well, there is a clear contradiction in policy behavior of the United States and South. They have found it expedient to intervene in Libya in terms of establishing a no-fly zone and protecting the Libyan people against the atrocities of the Gaddafi regime. But they have not really extended this to cover, for example, the Palestinians under the Israeli occupation. No people in the Middle East has required more protection than the people of Qatar, for example. And yet, the United States has made absolutely no efforts in terms of extending its conflict humanitarian intervention to cover either the people of Gaza or for that matter, the people in the West Bank and Jerusalem. So there is, and this is going to play on the minds of many Arabs in the region. And it is going to be thrown back at the Obama administration more intensively in the coming days and weeks.
My answer to John's question is very simple. The world, in the Middle East in particular, is in a seriously unstable moment. And should that happen, then that instability will exacerbate very, very rapidly. So it's a dangerous situation. A lot of risks have been taken, and things would get seriously out of hand if that happened.
I think if you really want to look for a case that's probably crying out for it, it's developing in Culture 1. So there is always a problem with capacity, which is why you don't want to intervene, you want to prevent.
Hi there. This is a good question to all three panelists. Despite the deepening economic and political relations between China and the Middle East countries, many of these Middle East countries remain sole allies of the United States. Do you foresee a point where eventually both countries, the United States and China, pursuing their interests in the region may lead to conflict, perhaps even tensions and so on?
A lot of the Western countries are US allies as China develops influence will become
It's true that so far, most of the Arab countries in the region have been allies of the United States, close allies of the United States. But of course, there's no certainty. I mean, we really don't know what direction Egypt is starting to take. And we don't know what direction Tunisia is starting to take. And there may be structural changes, structural political changes. And countries like Syria, and of course Yemen is very much on the verge of it. And we know that below the surface, there's considerable amount of anti-American feelings across the region. It is very significant how the United States is going to really manage the transition and the transformation that the Arab people are seeking at the moment and will be striving in the coming months and years. If the United States fails to manage its policy towards the Middle East in ways which is going to produce a balance in what the United States wants and what the people of the region aspire, then that will create an important power which could be easily felt by China. China already is in the Middle East. It is a big trading partner in the Middle East. China imports 11% of its oil needs from Iran. China does have a considerable amount of investment in Iran. China does sell arms to the region. And China is of the raw material, the natural resources. And the Middle East has plenty of it in terms of oil, in terms of gas. And most important, more importantly, a number of other minerals, particularly the ones which have been, for example, discovered in the wild Middle East, that is Afghanistan. The Chinese have already made $3.5 billion investment in the Afghan iron ore. And China will watch the situation very closely. And the more the United States and its allies fail in the region, the more that could widen the opportunities for China to play a greater role in the Middle East.
You can probably also study this kind of tension in a range of other situations, whether it's in Burma or North Korea, or in Sudan, Zimbabwe, where US and China's positions have started out very different. What's tended to happen is China has started to accommodate US concerns, act in a way that the US might perceive as more constructive, while safeguarding its core interests. That seems to be a very pragmatic kind of behaviour pattern. So I do not believe they're looking for confrontation in the United States, but they are very attuned to their core interests.
Yeah, my answer to the question would begin by saying I think the question is based on a false premise. I feel somewhat responsible for encouraging a false premise, because what I said at the end of my remarks about China's great power moment might have encouraged that way of thinking about China's projection itself into the Middle East or any other region for that matter. I didn't wish to do that at all. And what that means really is that, as Tony said, I think China's anxious to act constructively wherever it possibly can in this part of that part of the world and other parts of the world. For a very good reason. One, at this stage of its development anyway, it has neither the desire nor the capacity to project power, which will develop effective alliance relationships with, it's called dissident countries and dissident nations outside the alliance framework, if you like, the US alliance framework, anywhere in the world. It hasn't naval reach, which is necessary to support long-distance supply lines and all the rest of it. It relies on the US Navy for protection of its supply routes internationally. And it will for some time to come, many years to come, 15, 20 years to come, probably. So I don't think China has either the intention or the capacity to contest US interests in that way in the Middle East or anywhere else at this time.
Hi. There's been some scholarship about the last 10 years about concepts of non-Western, non-liberal forms of democracy. So regarding either of these popular uprisings in the Middle East and perhaps the potential for an uprising in China, whether that may or may happen, do you think these uprisings would be predicated upon Western conceptions of liberal democracy, or is another conception possible?
I don't think it is predicated on the Western concept of liberal democracy. I mean, I don't think we should expect uprisings in the Middle East to result in a replica of Western democracy. But what is most likely to emerge, particularly in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, and possibly Yemen in the longer run, and a number of other countries across the region, is more of a political pluralism and a greater public participation, and perhaps more institutionalization of politics as against personalization of politics. A political institution provides for political continuity and stability, rather than political institutions revolving around political personalities and therefore rise and fall with political personalities, which has been a major source of instability in the Middle East for a long time. But the important thing is that whether the outside world can really live with the outcomes of these pluralistic changes in the Middle East. They may work for one. For example, Islamic governments. Islamic governments, which in some ways may be hostile in one form or another to the US interests and to the interests of some of its allies, particularly Israel in the region. We know that in the past, the United States and some of its allies have not necessarily honored the democratic outcome. For example, Hamas won the democratic elections in Palestine at the beginning of 2006. But this was not an outcome which could be embraced either by Israel or for that by its international supporters. They turned around and said, look, on the one hand, we want you to democratize your politics. On the other hand, we want it in a way which is going to produce outcomes that could be acceptable to us. And I think that is going to be another major challenge, which is going to face the United States and its allies, particularly in the light of the current uprisings in the Middle East.
Professor Drysdale, you mentioned, of course, how everything is relative. China's authoritarianism is relative to the past, as well as, of course, the Middle East. Do you actually foresee China going down the path of democracy without an economic crisis? You talk about past how authoritarianism has been reducing them. I guess it's reducing general authoritarianism in the last 2 or 3 decades on the back of strong economic growth. And of course, in the Middle East, we've seen how, especially Libya and in Egypt, how authoritarianism combined with lack of economic opportunities has led to the current uprising. Do you actually see any shift in China's path towards democracy without an economic crisis? Is it just going to lead to slightly less authoritarianism and feeding everybody lots of money and everything, or is there actually going to be a shift without a big revolution?
Yes, I do. It's a simple answer to that question, because I think society which has the ambitions that China has for economic growth and any form of government there which is going to be successful in sustaining its legitimacy will have to respond in both processes by moving towards a more and more pluralistic and representative form of government. And this is a simple-minded view of things, and it is contested in quite a deep literature. But it still holds up fairly well, I think, to observe that for sustaining the success of economic growth, put simply, that China wishes to sustain, there comes a point where, beyond a certain stage of growth and development, a representative form of government is essential to continuing success. If you look at the top 30 countries in terms of the capital income, there are only 1 or 2 of those countries that are not some form of representative political system. And you can guess where they are, in the Middle East and so on. So that says something in itself. And this, as any big, in population terms or industrial base terms, country, needs some form of representative government to manage its economy efficiently beyond a certain point. Otherwise, that's likely to run in the sand. Now, I happen to think that that point is coming sooner rather than later in China. And I'm encouraged that you, despite the shift to the right of the left, however you describe it, that's supposed to be going in China today, in that view, because the primary debate within the Communist Party of Japan is not about if we need representative government, if we need a political reform. It's how to do it and when it might be done. It's a degree of difficulty past 9.999, which is a scale of thing and complexity thing. But the serious people who are thinking about system change and system maintenance and system sustenance are thinking about political system change. And they're doing that precisely the reason that I observed.
I guess my question follows on that. If you're pursuing good ecosystem change in China, and the principle of we don't interfere in other countries' affairs is no more appropriate given China's increasing position in the world, what does a more activist Chinese foreign policy look like?
Kind of related to that other question for Asia, which is, I really found this hint at the end of this talk really fascinating, which is that China's sense of self and its foreign policy orientation is under pressure to change. It wasn't clear whether it will or must change or this is happening through choice. And that will affect internal developments. That to me is fascinating. I'm curious to know how that plays out. In terms of China being more activist, I think you can look to them to be extremely cautious over the longer term, the medium term. There's a very interesting Burke, what's called an Daley paper that the International Institute of Strategic Studies put out on China's African challenges that sort of have this loose thesis running through it that and I've got a sense of this in Peter's remarks, that the deepening Chinese integration and set of interests in Africa and the Middle East meant that it could not just play to the developing world card or pretend it didn't have any responsibilities or any role to play. That it could make a choice of no choice. That it was actually enforced, to put pressure on the Sudanese regime to accept peacekeepers, to intervene in discussions between the Sudanese government and its rebels, to promote the kind of outcomes using its influence that other big actors in the international community are wanting. So I think it's cautiously doing this because it's probably picking up norms from elsewhere, but it's also finding that its interests are driving it there. But they're not going to turn into a crusading liberal power anytime soon.
I think what I share Tony's view pretty well entirely. Whatever China does in the near term is going to be not activist in either sense that Tony observed there at the end, or in other senses, because it's a power that for its own good reasons wants to play the rules, the international rules of the game as they're enunciated now. This might change. It's not likely to change soon, because the circumstances of China's economy and its political power are not going to change that quickly. Which probably requires me to explain the unanswered question at the end. I think it's a genuinely unanswered question. I don't think that China is likely to replicate the example of the former great powers. They have no intentions or inclination towards imperialism of that kind, and circumstances are such where imperialism of that kind would be not only extremely costly but self-destructive. So, as it assumes the mantle of great power in this day and age, it will assume that mantle, I think, perhaps more probably, by trying trying to reinforce system rules that are there which protect its interests, including UN system rules. Be much more activist in that sense. Not in a vetoing sense, but in a proactive sense with respect to the development of global system rules. That's an optimistic scenario. What might knock that off course, of course, is the thing that our colleague Hugh White talks about. The challenge by an emerging power like China, by its being to an established power like the United States, in some area of contested interest, particularly in our part of the world. And if that happens, in some circumstances, it might play back into a domestic constituency, a domestic polity that, for good reason, begins to assume hubris with respect to the established power and provides a place for a more activist role by the emerging power. But I think those eventualities are much less likely than other outcomes. And in that way, I differ somewhat from, I think you asked the right questions about this, but I differ somewhat from you in terms of these prognostications about the inevitability of a particular outcome.